Most loaves of sourdough bread contain about 100 to 200 grams of sourdough starter in the recipe. Some recipes might have like 30 to 50 grams of starter if it's on the lower end, but today I'm going to try to go as low as I can. I'm going to try to make a loaf of sourdough bread with just 1 gram of sourdough starter. 1 gram! Can 1 gram of sourdough starter really leaven an entire loaf of bread? Let's find out. I'm just following my standard sourdough bread formula for this recipe, but since I took out all the starter and I'm just using 1 gram, I'm adjusting the water and flour content in the recipe just to make up for the lack of starter. I'm adding 350 grams of water to this mixing bowl. Accidentally went over a little bit, so I'm just taking out 2 grams with a spoon. There we go. Now I'm going to add just 1 measly gram of this sourdough starter. I fed this last night like I normally do, 50 grams of water, 50 grams of flour. Now it's really bubbly and active, and it's doubled in size. I'm just going to use 1 gram of it, which depending on your scale can be really hard to accurately measure just 1 single gram. I definitely overshot this by a few grams. Let's see if I can subtract 2 grams and get down to just 1. And this is probably just 1 gram. Boom! And my scale didn't even register that this weighed anything at all, so it's obviously not much starter whatsoever. I'm going to add a little bit more just to try to weigh 1 gram, but my scale's giving me nothing. So I'm just going to estimate that this measly amount of starter is 1 gram, and I'm going to see if it can leaven an entire loaf of bread. I'm going to start off by just mixing this around in the water, trying to get the starter, the little amount that there is, as evenly distributed through the water as I can, so that it's evenly distributed throughout the dough. Now that the starter's mixed into the water, I'm going to add 500 grams of flour. For my normal recipe, again, that's 450 grams of flour, but I'm making up for the lack of starter in this recipe, going to the full 500. Now that the starter, water, and flour is all in the bowl, I'm adding in 10 grams of salt, and that will be the last ingredient that I need. Now I'm going to start mixing the dough, and once you start mixing sourdough starter with flour and water, it begins to rise. So I'm watching the clock. It's about 5:15 a.m., and I really want to see how long it takes this dough to rise, to almost double in size. That's assuming it even rises at all. I'm pretty sure it will. In theory, it's supposed to rise, even with a small amount of starter, but that's what I'm here to find out. So I'm mixing the dough until everything holds together, and ideally there aren't any dry clumps of flour left over. And then I'm just going to cover up this dough with a kitchen towel, and I'm going to let it rest and relax for about a half hour. After a half hour, the dough's going to hold together a lot better, and I'm going to do the first set of stretch and folds. 30 minutes later, time for stretch and fold number 1. I'm going to speed this up because you've probably seen stretch and folds before. And if you haven't, you can click the link in the description. That'll take you to my full recipe video where I'll show you step by step how to make this bread with a normal amount of starter. Anyway, I'm just doing the first set of stretch and folds, going a few times around the bowl. I'm pretty much going until the dough starts to show some resistance and it forms a nice smooth ball of dough. There we go. That was 3 or 4 times around the dough, and it's ready for another rest period. I'm going to cover the dough up and let it rest for another 30 minutes. A half hour later, I'm uncovering the dough and giving it another set of stretch and folds. I think I went around twice around the ball of dough this time until it started to show some resistance. Then I covered it up and let it rest for another half hour on the counter. Then 30 minutes later, time for the last set of stretch and folds. I just went around the dough 1 time on the last time because the dough had developed a lot of strength during the stretch and fold process. After the 3rd set of folds, I got out a glass bowl with a lid because I wanted to let my dough rise in this bowl. I like to be able to see through the sides so I see how much the dough is growing. I just oiled the bowl, popped in the dough with the smooth side up and the seam side on bottom. Then I popped the lid on and moved the dough to my microwave, which is one of the warmer spots in my kitchen. It's about 75 degrees in my kitchen today, which is pretty good, but I'm moving it to the microwave just so it stays in a draft-free place. I obviously hope that this little bit of starter does its job and actually leavens this dough, so I'm putting a little line just so I see how much the dough has grown over time. I'm probably going to be checking on this every couple of hours. Let's see what happens. Okay, it's been 12 hours since I mixed the dough, and I'm gonna check it and see if it's grown. I really haven't peeked at it much in the last couple of hours, so hopefully it's grown a little bit. 12 hours later, and there's definitely some growth. I'm not saying this has grown a ton, but this is definitely working. The 1 gram of sourdough starter is definitely leavening this dough. With my normal bread recipe that has 100 grams of starter, this would have been totally over fermented by 12 hours. At the temperature I'm at right now, at about 75 degrees in my kitchen, this totally would have overproofed. But with just 1 gram of starter, it's slowly rising, slowly fermenting. Seeing bubbles on the top of the dough there, that's pretty cool. I still haven't decided whether I'm gonna shape this dough tonight or if I'm gonna let it keep fermenting all night long, maybe a full 24 hours at room temperature. I'll check on the dough before I go to bed, and I'll say if it grows to this point in the bowl, then I'll just consider that good. But if it's still going really slowly, I might let it proof all night long. So I'll check back on this before I go to bed. Okay, I'm at like the 16-hour mark. I'm ready to call it a night, and this dough has definitely continued to grow. I'm really happy that this actually worked. I'm not quite ready to shape the bread tonight because I just want to call it a day. So I'm actually just going to move this dough to the fridge and let it hang out until the morning. I'll shape it in the morning and let it proof and bake it and see what happens. So 10 hours later, it is now time to let this dough come up to room temperature. I'm just going to leave it on the counter for a half hour. It really won't come up all the way to room temperature, but I do want it to just kind of loosen up in the bowl. Side note, sourdough starter is awesome. I can't believe this actually doubled in size with just 1 gram of starter. So cool. All right, it's a half hour later. The dough is warmed up a little bit. I'm just taking it out of the bowl with this bowl scraper. Then I'm gently forming it into a round ball for the pre-shape step using my bench knife. I used to use flour on the counter when I was pre-shaping, but I don't really do that anymore. I'm just gonna let this sit on the counter for 30 minutes before the final shape. For the final shape, I'm gonna dust the top with some flour just to make a non-stick barrier between that and the counter. Flip it over so the sticky side is up and the floured side is down. I'm gonna shape it gently into a rectangle. Fold 1/3 over the middle third and the third over the middle third. Then I'm just going to roll this into kind of like a tube, or just roll it into itself basically. That creates tension along the top of the loaf. Then I'm going to fold the flaps over and under the bottom, just something I like to do so the ends don't look weird. And there's my batard, my oval-shaped loaf. I'm going to pop that into a rice-floured Banneton basket. Then I'll let it sit on the counter for an hour and a half to proof at room temperature. About 30 minutes before the dough is ready to bake, I'm going to preheat the oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Some people say 450 is better than 500, so I'm going to give it a go this time. And my Challenger bread pan is in the oven preheating as well. Once the oven is hot and ready to bake, I'm flipping out the dough onto a cut sheet of parchment paper, brushing the top off a little bit, and I'm scoring with one long slash across the top with a new blade in my dough lamb. I'm removing the lid from the Dutch oven, carefully transferring the dough inside, and putting the lid back on. Then I'm going to bake this for 20 minutes with the lid on to trap the steam. 20 minutes later, the dough is ready to be revealed. And honestly, I was a little bit shocked by how flat this loaf was. It looks a little bit flatter than my normal loaves. I might have actually over-fermented it, which is kind of shocking. I never thought I'd be able to over-ferment dough with just 1 gram of sourdough starter. But it looks pretty good other than just being a little bit flat. I baked it for another 20 minutes at 450 degrees Fahrenheit, and I got some golden brown color on top of the loaf, which is exactly what I was looking for. This is definitely not the prettiest loaf that I've ever made. Looks a little scraggly on top, maybe a little bit flatter than my normal loaves, but it is a loaf of bread, and I made it with 1 gram of sourdough. I think that's pretty cool. I'm just gonna let this cool for about another hour before I can slice into it and show you how the inside looks. An hour later, I'm ready to slice into this bread, give it a taste, and see what it looks like on the inside. Now, I'm just a home baker. I definitely am not an expert in under fermentation and over fermentation, but I'd say based on how this looks a little bit collapsed, it's probably a little bit over fermented. I could have underdeveloped the gluten as well. Maybe I should have given it more stretch and folds during the bulk fermentation process. I'm not sure. If you've got insight into why it looks the way it does, let me know in the comments. I would love to hear what you think about that. But at the end of the day, when you're making homemade bread, all that really matters is that the bread rises and that it tastes good. So here I am to see if it tastes good. I'm slathering this with just a little bit of butter, and it's absolutely delicious. It tastes really similar to my regular sourdough loaf, but I think if I gave it a side-by-side taste test, that this bread would be a little bit more sour than my standard sourdough loaf of bread. It's definitely soft and fluffy on the inside and crunchy on the outside. Overall, really delicious. I just love sourdough bread. I love that you can use just a tiny amount of sourdough starter and end up with a loaf of bread. I think that's pretty cool. If you love sourdough or you want to get into sourdough, go ahead and subscribe to my channel and click this video here. It'll take you through my standard sourdough bread recipe. That'll show you how to make a regular loaf of sourdough bread using a normal person's amount of sourdough starter. I'll see you in the next video.